I just bought my dream ranch, but before I could unpack a single box, a woman I'd never met called the cops and said I was stealing my own house. What she did next? It nearly ruined everything, and you won't believe how it ended. After 20 years of serving this country, boots on the ground, sunrises seen through dust and danger, I came home with one thing on my mind: peace. Not the kind of peace you find in a loud neighborhood or behind white picket fences, but the real kind, the kind you feel when the wind rolls across open land and no one's barking orders in your ear. My wife and I had been planning this for years. Every paycheck we tucked away, every decision we made, it all led to this dream. A modest little ranch on the edge of a quiet Texas town, just big enough to give us room to breathe, grow a garden, maybe adopt a few horses nobody else wanted. It wasn't flashy or fancy, just a humble fixer-upper surrounded by wild grass, old oak trees, and sky that stretched forever. But it was ours. It was finally ours. The kind of place where you could feel your soul start to settle. We'd closed on it just a week before, and now the moving truck was loaded. My service buddies were helping with the heavy lifting. And that morning, with the sun peeking over the hills like a promise, I eased down the gravel road to my new home with pride swelling in my chest. There was something sacred about it. Seeing your wife standing on that porch smiling, knowing you'd built this life together with grit, sacrifice, and every ounce of faith you could muster. This wasn't just a house. It was the reward. It was the finish line and the starting point all in one. If you've ever spent your life giving everything for others, then you know the weight of that moment. And if stories like this speak to you, if you value respect, hard-earned peace, and standing tall in the face of injustice, I hope you'll subscribe and stay with me. Because out here we don't just tell stories, we tell the truth that lives in the heart of every man who's ever fought to protect what's his. And just when I thought we were finally home, finally safe, that's when she showed up, marching across my driveway with a clipboard in one hand and judgment in her eyes, looking straight at me like I was a criminal on land I had bled to afford. I was standing there in the warm Texas dust, boots planted on land I legally owned, sweat dripping from my brow as I hauled box after box into the home my wife and I had worked decades to afford. When out of nowhere, this woman comes zipping up in a little white golf cart like she's some kind of sheriff in a Sunday school dress. She didn't smile, didn't wave, just stared, eyes narrow, clipboard clenched, like it was a badge. She had that look, the one some folks get when they believe the world owes them control over everyone else's lives. Short blonde hair, sunglasses, the unmistakable energy of someone who's been running their neighborhood HOA too long and thinks that gives them dominion over strangers. She stopped right at the edge of my driveway, didn't even introduce herself, and with a voice full of suspicion barked, "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" At first I chuckled, thinking maybe she'd gotten the wrong address or was confused about which house had sold. I wiped my hands on my jeans and said plainly, "We're moving in." My buddies, two of them former Marines, paused mid-lift, looking over like they were waiting for a punchline. But there wasn't one. Without missing a beat, she shook her head and stepped off the cart, pointing at the moving truck like it was evidence of a crime. "This is private property," she snapped. "You can't just steal someone's belongings and drive off in broad daylight." I froze. For a second I thought I'd misheard her. But no, she wasn't confused. She actually believed I was stealing the contents of my own home. I opened my mouth to explain, wanted to tell her the deed was in the house, that we'd just signed paperwork, that I'd fought wars overseas so I could afford this piece of peace. But she wasn't interested. Before I could get out more than a few words, she raised her phone and, with all the righteous fury of someone completely convinced she was doing the Lord's work, said 5 words that made my stomach twist into knots. "I'm calling the sheriff's department." I stood there dumbfounded, gripping a cardboard box labeled kitchen, watching my wife, who had just walked onto the porch, finally smiling after weeks of stress, go pale. One of my buddies tried to reason with her, explaining we were veterans just moving into our new home, but she waved him off like a mosquito and muttered something about keeping the neighborhood safe and scammers targeting upscale areas. I could barely breathe. Not because I was afraid of the law, I'd always respected the badge, but because I knew the weight of her assumption. I knew how quickly things could spiral when someone jumped to conclusions based on nothing but a glance. My dignity, my years of service, my family's hard-earned dream, none of it mattered to her. In that moment, all she saw was someone she didn't recognize doing something she didn't approve of. The injustice wasn't just in her words. It was in her certainty. She didn't ask, she accused, she didn't verify, she judged. And while she strutted off back to her little golf cart to wait for the sheriff like she'd just saved the world, I stood there questioning how it could feel like I was being trespassed on my own land. My wife set the box she was carrying down and walked over, gripping my hand tightly. I saw it in her eyes, anger, fear, sadness all rolled into one. "I thought this place would be different," she whispered, and I didn't have the heart to tell her what I was thinking. So did I. That's the thing about dignity. You spend a lifetime building it through your actions, your integrity, your sacrifice. And it only takes one entitled stranger to try and strip it away with a phone call and a false claim. But what came next? That changed everything. Because 10 minutes later, when the sheriff's cruiser pulled into my driveway, it wasn't me they walked up to first, it was my wife. And what the deputy said to her? It cut deeper than any uniformed insult I'd ever heard in my life. 15 minutes dragged by like an hour, until the sheriff's cruiser finally rolled up the gravel path, kicking up dust clouds that clung to the air, like the weight sitting heavy in my chest. The deputy stepped out, tall and broad, hand resting, just close enough to his holster to send a message, though he hadn't said a word yet. My wife gripped my arm, her knuckles white, and I could feel the heat of shame crawling up the back of my neck. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because we were being treated like we had. I reached into the moving box I'd set down earlier and pulled out my wallet, handing over my ID, the mortgage documents, and even pulled up the Zillow listing on my phone, the one with our names in bold print right beneath the photo of our new home. The deputy looked over the documents carefully, his eyes flicking back and forth between the screen and my license, but still, he didn't let up. "I need to check this with dispatch," he said. And just like that, the weight of someone else's doubt hung over me like a storm. Karen was off to the side, arms crossed and lips curled into a smug smile like she'd just exposed a criminal. She piped up loudly enough for everyone to hear, "He doesn't look like the type who owns a ranch like this." That line hit like a punch. My buddy, who'd been in Afghanistan with me, shifted his weight and clenched his fists, but I raised a hand to keep him from saying something we'd regret. The deputy turned toward her and said, "Ma'am, he's shown legal ownership." You'd think that would have ended it, but Karen wasn't done. "Maybe the documents are fake," she shot back, voice dripping with suspicion. "People run all kinds of scams these days, especially with property." I didn't flinch. I'd been accused before. I'd been doubted. I'd even been shot at by people who never asked questions. But what cut deepest was watching my wife's face as she turned to Karen and said, her voice trembling, "You didn't even ask who we were. You just assumed." Karen didn't miss a beat. She rolled her eyes and muttered, "We have standards in this community." Standards. That word echoed in my head like a slap. Apparently, around here, standards meant judging someone by the calluses on their hands, the color of their skin, or the fact that their front porch didn't have matching flower pots yet. The deputy stepped aside to call dispatch, and there we stood. My family, my friends, all of us sweating in the sun while the woman who called us criminals watched with satisfaction. The air was thick with something worse than heat. It was the sting of being treated like an outsider, a liar, a threat, on my own land. The other neighbors had started to gather now, people I hadn't even met yet, all staring, whispering, holding their phones like they were filming some kind of show. No one offered a hello. No one offered help, just silent stares as if my entire life was under review. And when the deputy finally came back from the car, he looked at me, not Karen, and said, "I need you to stay here while we verify everything through the county." As if my word, my documents, my service, my sweat, all of it, meant nothing. And in that moment, standing there in front of the house I had dreamed of for 20 years, surrounded by suspicion, silence, and strangers who'd already made up their minds. I realized I wasn't being treated like a neighbor. I was being treated like a threat. That's when the deputy had enough. He shifted his stance, squared his shoulders, and gave Karen a look that instantly changed the temperature of the scene. With calm authority, he walked over and motioned for her to step aside. The smug confidence that had been plastered all over her face just moments earlier started to melt away. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught the key words: filing, a false report, legal consequences, and misuse of emergency services. Karen's voice, which had been so loud and bold when accusing me of theft, turned shaky and defensive. She started stammering, saying she just wanted to be cautious, that she thought she recognized the moving truck from somewhere else. But the deputy wasn't letting it slide. His tone was professional but sharp, and each word he spoke seemed to chip away at the fantasy of control she'd been clinging to. He explained firmly and clearly that continuing to harass residents without reason could bring legal consequences. And if she made one more baseless accusation, she could be the one getting a visit from the sheriff's office, not the other way around. That moment, watching her deflate and stumble backward, not because I wanted revenge, but because someone finally stood up for what was right, felt like a small breath of justice in a week that had nearly stolen my peace. Karen didn't offer an apology. She didn't meet our eyes. She just huffed, turned on her heel, and climbed back into her little golf cart like a retreating general whose army had already surrendered. The cart kicked up a cloud of dust as she peeled off, retreating toward the paved part of the neighborhood like she couldn't escape fast enough. The deputy came back to where we stood, me, my wife, and my buddies, still silent in the wake of it all, and with a sigh and a half smile, he extended his hand. "Sorry you had to deal with that," he said. "Welcome to the neighborhood." I shook his hand and nodded, still too wound up to speak, but grateful that someone in authority had drawn a line. It wasn't justice in full, not yet, but it was something. It was a start. I looked over at my wife and saw her shoulders relax for the first time all day. Her grip on my arm softened, and for a moment, the porch looked like home again. One of my buddies clapped me on the back and said, "Well, at least now they know whose land this really is." We went back to unloading, but everything felt a little different now. I wasn't just moving into a house, I was standing my ground. I realized then that peace isn't something you find, it's something you fight to protect. And while Karen's golf cart may have driven off into the distance, the story wasn't over. Because just 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail that would change everything. 2 mornings after the dust settled, I walked out to the mailbox and pulled out a thick envelope. No return address, just my name scrawled across the front in sharp, blocky letters. Inside was a typed letter, unsigned, but it didn't take long to figure out who sent it. It was from a longtime resident who'd seen the whole fiasco unfold. He thanked me for staying calm and mentioned that Karen, whose real name was Dolores Mitchell, hadn't been on the HOA board in over a year. She'd been asked to step down after repeated complaints of harassment and unauthorized enforcement of non-existent rules. I stood there, reading that letter with the morning breeze tugging at the corners, realizing just how much bluster one person could cause when left unchecked. She had no power, no right to question me, and yet she nearly turned my first day on my own land into something ugly enough to stain the whole experience. But now, standing on that gravel drive, the letter in one hand and the sun warming my back, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. Solid ground beneath my feet. A few hours later, a couple I hadn't met before drove up in a pickup and stepped out with a tray covered in foil. "We heard what happened," the woman said, her voice kind but tired, "and we're sorry that was your introduction to this place." She handed over a peach cobbler that tasted like it came straight out of a church cookbook from the 60s. It was warm, sweet, and more comforting than I'd expected a dessert to be. That simple gesture cracked the wall I didn't realize I'd started building. Over the next few days, more neighbors trickled in, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. One guy helped me fix a sagging gate. Another lent me his chainsaw so I could clear out brush behind the barn. A retired Navy corpsman from down the road dropped off a spare saddle and invited me to ride with his group on Saturdays. Slowly, the community revealed itself. Not the loud, self-appointed gatekeepers like Karen, but the real folks. Quiet, hardworking, respectful. People who knew the value of a handshake, a shared meal, and minding their own business unless someone genuinely needed help. And every single one of them in their own way said the same thing. We're glad you're here. That other stuff? It's not who we are. Those words stuck with me. I came to this ranch thinking I was chasing peace, but I found something better. Rootedness. A place where my hands, calloused from years in uniform, could turn soil instead of saluting. Where my wife could hang wind chimes without worrying about a citation, and where the sun rising over the back pasture reminded me that freedom isn't just about flags and parades, it's about being allowed to belong. Karen never came back, and I never saw her again. But even if I had, I wouldn't have wasted another breath arguing. Not because I'm afraid, but because I've learned there's a difference between power and noise. She made a lot of noise, but the real power showed up in quiet acts of neighborly kindness, the kind that doesn't need an audience. That first week taught me something I hadn't expected. Even in retirement, there are battles. Not with weapons, but with patience, with dignity, with holding your ground without losing your center. And when I look around now, at the barn my buddies helped patch, at the garden my wife planted along the porch, at the neighbors who wave when they drive by, I don't feel like a stranger anymore. I feel like a steward. This land isn't just mine by deed. It's mine because I stayed, because I didn't let one person's ignorance chase me off, because I trusted that the truth in time would rise like the sun over these hills. And that's what I want to leave you with, especially if you've ever been made to feel like you didn't belong in a place you worked your whole life to reach. Sometimes, the real test comes not from how loud you can shout, but how firmly you can stand when someone tries to knock you down. And if you can stand through that, if you can weather the unfairness, the assumptions, the noise, you just might find that the life waiting for you on the other side is stronger, sweeter, and more meaningful than anything you left behind. Because dignity isn't something you're given, it's something you defend, quietly, patiently, and without apology. So if you've ever been judged before someone knew your name, if you've ever had to prove you belong on the land you paid for with hard work and sacrifice, then you understand what this story really means. It's not about one bad neighbor, it's about standing tall when your dignity's on the line. And if this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of something you've lived through or someone you know, then I'd be honored to have you stick around. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and join me here, where real stories matter, where respect still means something, and where we don't back down just because someone in a golf cart says we should. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.